Super Q&A. Super Q&A. Um, as has been expressed time and time again this morning, this has just been such a powerful, powerful weekend, full of, I think, important and valuable information about American history and our past. And it provides a better way to understand what it means to be an American is to understand slavery, just because it's so embedded in our culture, right? It's embedded in the fabric of our nation. So we had some changes of schedule, and we realized that we have this fabulous group of scholars, and they've presented us with their research and their knowledge and their years of study. And we talked to them and we said, would you guys be willing to kind of sit here for a little while and answer some questions from the crowd? And they all unanimously agreed. And I think it's a testament to who they are as scholars, right? To say, you know what, I think what we have to do, what we have to present is that valuable. And we also, as a team at the Witty, realized that yesterday was just jam-packed, right? It was just jam-packed with information, and maybe we all didn't get an opportunity to really process everything that we learned and heard. And so we thought that maybe with a few hours to kind of sleep on it and think on it, some of those questions that you didn't even know you had, you might be able to ask this morning. And so we wanted to kind of open up the floor to you all to ask questions of us. It doesn't have to necessarily be about the topics we presented. If you want to ask about like education questions, like how do I bring this to my students? Those kinds of questions are also valid as well. But to kind of get started, I thought if you guys could kind of think about, like, you guys came to the Witty and you presented your research, you presented the things that you have studied. As you had a chance to reflect on kind of these last 2 days and what you've seen here and what we've done, how do you think your work will affect kind of what happens in San Antonio going forward? Like, how do you think your work will affect or help people think about the history of the United States?
I'll go ahead and start. Dinah Ramey Berry. I kicked off the conference with some brief remarks. And I have to say, just listening to your remarks, Dr. Everidge, Michelle, that your summary was a master class in an overview of what we need to know about this history. So, thank you. I'm honest, seriously, about that. The way you described everything that we all did, everything that we covered over the last day and a half, is what needs to be in history books. It's what we need to be teaching in our classroom. It's what we need, how we need to train our students. And I remember not too long ago, when I was going through the historiography of slavery, there was a time where scholars wanted to make sure we had a consensus. We understood it as sort of this through line. And there was a shift in the literature in the 70s and early 80s where we started looking at more smaller community studies, county studies, and going into more intimate aspects of the experience. And we've been in that same mode for a while, and some scholars are saying we need to pull out and do a consensus. But as we delved deeper, we saw all the different sites of slavery, all the different types of labor, all the different forms of labor, all the different contributions. And we've been able to see enslaved people and see slavery in a much different way. So I think for me, that's the reflection, and I thought, I can't wait till this volume comes out, because this is the slavery that we teach, and this is the slavery that needs to be known.
Is there?
Can I?
Yeah.
Also, I just want to, for me, this gathering reiterates that while we may have PhDs, the experts are out there as well. And we need to be listening as much to y'all as y'all are to us. I mean, the number of stories that we have gotten to hear from y'all, the number of article ideas that I now have ruminating in my head, we need more opportunities for community members, librarians, students, archivists, museum folks, academics to all come together to learn from each other. So thank y'all. Thank y'all.
Okay, we have one.
Well, first of all, Michelle, I agree. This is just so powerful, and you've already written the introduction to the book. It's just extraordinary. And the takeaway for me is as museum people, we know how the power of primary sources and evidence, of course, as Michelle noted. But the focus on individual stories and the humanity is so palpable moving from these 2 days, and it's just been extraordinary. I have ironically, I never asked these kinds of questions, but I have a lexicon kind of question for me to be educated, possibly Dr. Ray, but and that is, I haven't heard the term generational trauma in this entire conference. So is this, and we talked about it briefly, is this a discredited term now? Because we don't want to use anything that is no longer not only apropos or offensive. So if maybe you could address that.
Yeah, I didn't use the exact word generational trauma, but when talking about weathering, talked about epigenetics, right? And I think generational trauma is just another way of talking about this term, right? That a lot of what we experience as people formerly enslaved, Jim Crow, segregation, continued structural racism, that those effects can be passed down to our future generations, right? And I think that is one of the largest parts of maternal mortality. We can talk about the sort of concrete things about access to Medicaid. We can talk about access to prenatal care, all of those things. But for me, I think the biggest things that we have to address is how these traumas are passed down and then passed down in utero, the effects of them. It's a very real thing, which is why you always hear people talking about pregnant people and saying, don't be stressed and that kind of thing. And I think for people who are dying 3 times higher rates, some parts of the country 4 times higher rates than white women, it's not just about stress, it's about the effects of racism and sexism, the effects of social disadvantage or being socially disadvantaged, right? So yes, I think generational trauma is absolutely something we have to think about in health. I just think more often you're going to hear people talk about it in terms of epigenetics. You hear a lot about it in maternal mortality, as I said, but it can happen in other areas as well. Yeah.
All right.
Good morning again. Did I miss the thing on escaping slavery's capitalism?
He had yes, you missed it because he didn't come. Yes, so yes, you missed it, but yes, he got stuck in, well, I think we can still answer that question.
Okay, yeah.
We have plenty of.
I'm about to come hard. Okay, so what is the role of reparations as direct cash payments to alleviate some of these issues, in particular, multi-generational poverty that plays into some of these maladies we see in the descendants of those persons who were from the enslaved?
Can I add something to that? I think maybe the entry point for that is to talk about the economic impact of slavery on the United States, and then we can kind of come back into how reparations might work.
So I can't necessarily speak to the whole United States and the economic impact, but what I can say is the trade in human bodies in the United States was the equivalent of a stock market, right? It had its own supportive industry of brokers that is equivalent to the stock market today, and that's trillions of dollars. So just to give that perspective, but one of the things that I am doing more recently in looking at the old 300 specifically and exploring the head rights, right? We know there were 4 waves of head rights associated with coming to Texas, and that along with allocations of land per individual male, per children, there were head rights associated with bringing enslaved people. So it's 80 acres for each enslaved person. And if you begin to calculate, as I have began calculating per acre, right, and you think about the number of enslaved persons any individual member of the old 300 brought with them, you get into the billions of dollars. If we were to think about those individuals who identify as descendants of the old 300, we have many dimensions of repair and reparations to be engaged with at least that set of us that have been here since the time of the Republic. So I would say that in these forums, we have an opportunity to begin to explore that history, to share that history, but also begin to look at the implications. And I think that's the strength of this entire event, is that the history is about the past, it's about the present and the future.
So I'd like to speak about it from a teaching standpoint, and thinking about slavery affected the whole United States. It was the economic lifeblood of the United States. I teach at Michigan State University, and teaching students that mostly hail from the North, they're like, that's something that happened in the South. The South is the one culpable. We eliminated slavery early. No, the whole United States was culpable. During the Civil War, the mayor of New York City, Wood, his last name was Wood, filed a petition to secede from the United States, from the Union, and join the Confederacy, because New York City and its economic lifeblood was so connected to slavery. The banks funded enslaved insurance, gave loans to enslavers. And so we have to think of it from the standpoint that there's culpability everywhere, responsibility everywhere. And also what I'd like to share with my students is to show the law in the state of California that shows that the descendants of enslaved people whose ancestors were insured, they have a right to know about that information. It doesn't say they have a right to have reparations, but just to know about it. And so we have a discussion in my classes, is what does it mean to say that there's responsibility there and to repair that breach economically, socially? So it's a discussion that we need to have just as a country, and also even, I think, in education as well.
I don't know if Dr. Berry, you might want to talk about your work and the valuation of enslaved bodies.
So two things. One, there's a special issue from the Russell Sage Foundation that came out in June of last year on Black reparations. There's about, I don't remember, we did 2 volumes for that. I was one of the editors for that. And there were sociologists, economic scholars, a number of others, historians, and also William Darity, who wrote a book about Black reparations, was one of the lead editors. So I would look at that. Oh, okay, so you already know. You already know about it. Well, I was just saying, for those that don't, it's a great volume to see the complexities in different cases where there was cities and places where they tried to issue reparations. So that's just one point of reference for those that want to know more. In terms of the prices, I came to this, I did not in Pound of Flesh describe, I didn't come up with, I went back and forth on whether or not I was going to include a chapter on reparations. And because at the time, and I'm still in this space, at the time I did not have the exact, I felt like if I was going to talk about reparations, I needed to be able to say, and this is how we do it, or this is how it should be done, and this, I feel like I should have a platform or some kind of policy. And I didn't have that. It hasn't come to me yet, you know. But I do think I think about restoration, and I think that in addition to reparations, we need to be restored. And restoration involves a number of things. You know, it involves looking at the disparities in educational system, the disparities in housing, the disparities in healthcare, all kinds of areas where we can be restored. And I think that is a starting point. Some people like Dr. Darity are like, write a check, every African American gets $75,000, and a lot of people are for that. My pause on that, it's not that I'm against it, but my pause on that is that we'll write you a check, don't complain about racism. Everything is done, check, it's done. And I worry that that doesn't solve the issues that we need to talk about, like the issues we've talked about at this conference. My last... Okay, so what would you say? I mean, he wants everybody to have a check, right?
Well, Dr. Beardy feels like reparations is very similar to what we did with the Japanese Americans.
Yes. Yes.
And so there is a direct cash payment, but as part of his plan and From Here to Equality, he talks about an institutional method whereby which we would monitor those injustices that are happening. Because as you know, you can give people a check and someone will exploit them out of it.
Exactly.
But and that amount you said is way lower. He
Okay,
says
my
that
bad.
minimum is 21 trillion. So that
Oh, that's
would
a
be
total, but I thought individually he had.
no, it's
oh.
more than 75,000.
Okay, my bad. Thank you
No
for
worries.
the correction. Yeah. I knew it was in the trillions of dollars for the total value. I knew that. And he's calculated that. What I was going to say about that related to slavery is that we can calculate. We know how much enslaved people cost. We know how much they were at different stages of their lives. We know how much they were insured for. We know how much they had life insurance policies on them for. We know how much they received when they passed away. We know, I mean, we have so much. And so that's what I was trying to do in Pound of Flesh, is just to be able to provide some data for those that were creating programs and platforms like Dr. Darity, because I didn't have the capacity or the understanding of all the other layers that should be included in that. And I felt like I want to have a seat at the table to talk about this and to provide the data from where I sit, and that is in the archives, looking at records and documenting enslaved people and their values.
Hi, my name is Anna. I am the Community Relations Manager for Bank of America. Very, very happy to have the opportunity to come and listen and learn. This question is for Dr. Berry. So I heard you yesterday in regards to talking about our textbooks in public schools. As a mother of 2 school-aged children, and also knowing that there are, like you said, you know, you're not trying to make edits, you're trying to fill in the narrative. So we've had trying to fill in the narrative on the Alamo, but the textbooks that you have updated, gone through, worked on, where are they in the public schools? Are they already out there? Are they in the schools here in San Antonio, all of Texas? Like, where are they?
So great question. I did 2 textbooks for McGraw-Hill middle school textbooks and 2 high school textbooks for McGraw-Hill. I would have to look to see which school districts adopted them. I'm not quite sure, but I could check. I know from the marketing that we're doing now for the textbook, the college textbook, America Narrative History, I have meetings in Texas, and I know there are a number of community college systems in Texas that adopt that book. I do know that. And I'll give you one example of the kinds of things that we did. And I remember showing this to Nakia at a conference once. In chapter 1, initially in America, the enslaved people came in chapter 4. So black people, African-descended people showed up in chapter 4 as enslaved. And I thought, what about, you're talking about the clash of cultures, you're talking about Europe and Asia and South America, and there's no Africa here. So what we ended up doing was adding a whole section in that first chapter on African kingdoms and societies, on African explorers, on African culture, everything about African excellence that was not there. And at the same time that we're talking about other nations and other communities, so that when we look at the clash of cultures, black people don't just show up as objectified enslaved people who were downtrodden and brought to the New World. So that is powerful, and it's a section, there's images of Mansa Musa. And then we added stories about enslaved women, about indigenous women, about Latinx women throughout the entire volume. And that was something that we worked on to make sure that when we were telling stories about different parts of American history, we were thinking who else was involved, who else was there, and how can we incorporate those stories. I do know Texas they have a lot of the Americas volume. I would have to check on McGraw-Hill, so I don't know about those volumes.
Is that something that we can find on the TEA website, or on which districts adopted?
I don't know if they have it on the website. Let me look into that. I can check with the distributor, and if you give me your contact information, I can let you know.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, good morning. I'm Barbara Taylor. I'm the Assistant Dean for the MD and PH program at the Long School of Medicine at UT Health in San Antonio. And I first just want to say thank you all so much, and thanks to the Whitty for this conference. It has been not happy, but a joy to be here, and I've learned a lot. I was going to ask this question to Dr. Ray, but now that you're all here, I'm going to ask it to all of you. I'm a huge fan of your work, Dr. Ray, and as an educator, I think one of the things that this conference has done are 2 things that I think are very important. It has centered people, and it has created a safe space for dialogue. And we at the medical school work very hard to do that, but there are always ways that we fall short. And we are confronting many of the perceptions that you all have discussed, that racism or slavery is a Southern problem, that Black people's bodies experience pain different from anybody else's bodies. How do you create safe spaces where people can feel comfortable telling you their sometimes racist sort of things that have been passed down to them or understandings? And then how do you address those beliefs and turn the tide? Thank you.
Yeah, one thing that we do at McGovern Medical School, similar, is, so in my classes, and some others, we got rid of the fake case studies first off. We started using just real stories. And that's one of the things that I use in my book, talking about Black health through real people's stories. You can go Google them, you can go find them, they're out in the world. Because it adds a reality to it. It adds a sort of like, this is not just something my instructor created on her computer, but that there's a real person experiencing this. And so we're using real stories of patients talking about their racist experience, so then they can see the effects that it has on a real person, right? And we've even expanded it to a little bit longer than just the 3 sentences, where they can also tell us how this impacted them. Like, oh, I couldn't go to work, I couldn't go play with my kids, right? And so through that, and we give them the reality, but then we also try to abstract the sort of racist comments that people have about it, so they don't feel like they have to say it from them, kind of way, right? So we'll say, I'll bring up here's something that is commonly people have common responses to this kind of narrative. They'll say, you didn't work out, you didn't exercise, you probably just sit on the couch all day, you just eat McDonald's all day. People commonly think this way. They moralize Black health in this way and blame the individual, right? Here is some research that we talk about. Here's this story. And then I find that they're able to say, like, okay, I've thought that too, or especially if they rotate in their 3rd year, so especially if they're already seeing patients, and they'll say, I heard a doctor in clinic say this, right? Very recently, I had a student tell me that his attending used the term Hispanicus panicus for a patient in pain. And I use that experience to say, okay, let's talk about pain care. Let's talk about pain care for people of color. Let's talk about hidden curriculums. Let's talk about racist beliefs, right? So also using their experiences already in the clinic, where they can say, not me, but my attending said this, right? Let's learn from it. But I really try to abstract them away from it and say, people have said these things, these racist things. Here's a common racist response. And then they can go over it and we can talk about it. But it all stems from that very real case study, and I find that was very, very huge for for our students, is knowing that this is a real person out in the world living their life, not just some Susie, 35-year-old Black. This is a real person. That helped us.
For me, I think it's just about basic lessons in communication. As you said, this has been a safe space. We have people up here, you all in the audience, who have contributed just as much to these conversations and subject matter from different walks of life, age, race, ethnicity. And I think just opening the doors for those dialogues. In my courses, and I'm sure Dr. Roberts, Dr. Stewart, Dr. Berry do similar things, I teach a course, African American Experiences in Architecture. I study buildings, objects, tangible things that you can touch or things that used to be there. But for me, it's just as much about those objects, those things, as about the people who inhabited those spaces. And so sort of re-enlivening those spaces, not only in what I'm teaching my students, but in how we encounter them in the classroom is very important. In my class, it carries the cultural diversity flag at the university, and so students have to take that class, and part of that is having discussion. And so students have to present discussion questions over the course of the semester
and I have them lead discussion. Every now and then, you know, I'll jump in with my 5, 10, or 25 cents, but it's an opportunity to allow them to talk. There's no right or wrong answer. We don't even have to have an answer to the question. It's just to open those doors for conversation. I have had students, and it's mostly my white students, who sometimes say to me, you know, in office hours or after class, well, I didn't think I could be a part of that conversation, but I just learned so much listening. Like, I wanted to say something, but I felt that I should, and that's okay. I have students who I'm like, all right, preach, sister, you know, who get up in class and say things sometimes. And so it runs a gamut, but being able to have those opportunities for conversation is really important for us to learn from one another. I tell my students I'm a lifelong student, as much as, you know, I am their teacher, and I learn from them all the time. But for them to be able to then go out as designers and architects, maybe hopefully teachers, as parents, as children, to be able to bring that information, you know, and the things that they're learning that they didn't know about out of the classroom into venues like this and in their professions, in their communities, is extremely important. And with that, again, I thank the Witty immensely, and all of you and you for your contributions to the past couple of days.
Thank you all.
Good morning. My name is Gray. I'm a student. I wanted to ask, for those of you on the panel and everybody in the audience, slavery is a very heavy topic to speak on, to learn about even, and like, I love history. That's something I have a true passion for, but it's hard to read all of that. It's hard to look into all of that from a mental health aspect. Like, how do y'all, how do y'all like handle the weight of all the subjects that you look into and all the things that you study?
Hi. Well, I don't want to sound like a smarty, and I'm sort of revising my response there. But I think it's one thing to teach and research slavery, right? Mm-hmm. It certainly requires a different or many sets of different skills, right? And as a researcher, someone who writes about it and who teaches about it, after a while, I think, well, it never gets easy. Yeah. It does something to you. Mm-hmm. But I always have to remember that my discomfort and perhaps my students' discomfort pales in comparison to what the enslaved actually experienced, right?
Yeah.
And so, thank you. And so if they could have endured it, mm-hmm. right, and emerged mostly intact on the other side, right? Mm-hmm. 45 minutes Tuesday and Thursday, you'll be all right, right? And that is not to be, you know, dismissive in any way, because it does affect, especially students of color, right? Mm-hmm. At PWIs, you know, if you're one of 3 in a room of 40, right? Mm-hmm. And folks are looking at you and heads are down when, you know, Gordon is on the PowerPoint, right? But I just have to remind, again, my students and myself, right? Yes, this stuff is heavy. It does shatter the spirit at various points. But the key lesson that I always want to impart to students of slavery is that look at the power and the resilience of the enslaved and how they made it over. And so again, yes, it's traumatic, it's heartrending, but you know, you can do it. And this information should be empowering to you once you have mastered it in some way. So I hope that helps, but yeah.
I think I would add just a couple of things to that. I mean, sometimes it's okay to be uncomfortable. You know, we have to kind of get away from this place of like, of not wanting to be uncomfortable. It's history. Humans are messy. It's always going to be uncomfortable. We have to kind of accept that. Yeah. And I would add to what Jermaine was saying, like and when you look at these stories, right, when you look at this pain that these people went through, what I always try to find in their stories is how they express their self-worth, how they express how this didn't break them, right? They went through this experience. I read a narrative yesterday about this one man who talked about making a mistake and getting whipped, and he described how he said it hurt my body, but I never let it take my heart. I never let it take my heart, right? Those are the things that we have to understand. And like Jermaine was saying, these stories are not, yes, it's painful, but when I look at these enslaved people and their experiences, their ability to endure is inspirational to me, right? Their ability to move beyond that pain is inspirational to me. And so like, I think that can also help. But I also take a lot of walks and I meditate, right? I do Tai Chi, like for me as a person, like to kind of help me release also that pain that I feel, right, when I research. I try to do that self-care as well. I get pedicures and all those kinds of things as well. Like those things help. I mean, it's like that real self-care is also important, you know, but so there's all these different ways that we have to figure out how to navigate the research that we do and the things that we study.
Say just one thing. Nell Irving Painter talks about how white people don't have to feel the burden of race. That is something that is the hard work of people of color. So for white folks in the room, I think it's important, essential to study this history because we're not feeling the burden in that way, but we need to know about it to be able to contribute to hopefully dismantling the white supremacist structure that so many people have talked about over the last 2 days.
Actually, it might also help if we understood that we have a more general societal problem, and that is that we want to avoid being uncomfortable, generally, whether it's mental health, whether it's educational opportunity, it doesn't matter what, we don't want to be uncomfortable. And the important thing is to feel okay with being, in other words, to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, to intentionally go into situations where you're going to be uncomfortable because that's where you'll have an opportunity to grow. You don't have an opportunity to grow when you stay in your comfort zone. And in particular, with the topic of, and in my own case, I don't deal with more modern slavery. I deal with a slavery that kind of goes through a transition and becomes something else in Texas. But it's they're in talking to people, what I try to get them to understand is that the roots of the society that we have today go back really, really deeply. And the pat, comfortable way that we looked at Texas history, particularly early Texas history, doesn't serve us very well. And only by going back and re-examining and being uncomfortable with that re-examination can we come up with something that will serve us better. So.
When I read portions of Reverend John McCamey Wilson's will, where he left some of his slaves as property, willed some of his slaves as property, doled them out to different members of his family, I was angry. I was not uncomfortable. Yeah. And so we must find a place to manage the things that make us angry, the things that are painful, the things that make us sad. Emancipation had already occurred. I'm going to say that one more time. Right. Emancipation had already occurred. H. Wilson and Company had already been formed. Reverend, as a preacher, myself, Reverend John McCamey Wilson died and willed his slaves as property. And I was angry. So, my dear friend, we must find space, okay, to see the value in the things that make us angry, the things that make us uncomfortable, and the things that are painful for us. When I saw the dollar amounts and I saw, you know, as our people were traded, sold, left, and the values that were placed upon them at that time, and they were seen as a commodity. I saw things differently this week and as I was preparing my presentation, and I believe that the value that they saw in us as commodities at that time, we must now find space within ourselves and affirm ourselves and the value that is within us. So my question to you is, where do you see yourself and how do you value yourself? Because that is where the strength truly lies, and how we see ourselves and not how man sees us.
Thank you.
Hi, Rolanda Teal. I'm coming from an anthropological background as I ask this question. As we see things are being walked back, one of the things I'm noticing and what I really appreciate about this conference is the multidisciplinary approach that was taken. We didn't just have historians, we didn't just have, and so that's been very wonderful. And it's through that, of course, that we learn from each other and learn different aspects. But I'm wondering at this particular time, because I haven't heard anyone address it, I am trying to incorporate in my anthropology classes now more information around LGBTQ plus community activities and how those studies and what you all are researching, where do we go with that? As a researcher myself, who's been out here many years, I know that it is very difficult to find the records that we're looking for. You spend years and years, but it's even harder then to identify the LGBTQ plus, especially if you're talking about from slavery coming forward. Are you guys finding this type of information, and how do you think it should be incorporated in your work? And then also, like for you, Dr. Mays, isn't it a different layer when you're looking at these stats between that community and just the Black community? So that's where I'm going to leave it.
Oh, yeah. So finding stats, I find that finding stats for certain groups are so very difficult. Finding stats on LGBTQ is very difficult. Finding stats on, not necessarily stats, but stories about Black men's experiences with certain health outcomes has been something that I've also been struggling with. But at the same time, it's not something I want to ignore, because there are layers to Black health. And whenever you're talking about Black health, there are some general things that are applicable to no matter who you are, but there are some things that are very specific to certain communities and to certain groups. And you want to make sure that you're being sensitive to that, because it's not always, I never want to inflict the epistemological violence onto some other group that has been inflicted upon us. I never want to ignore someone's stories the way that ours were ignored. I never want to do that. But also, I want to do it right. Right? I don't want to just do it to do it if I'm not able to do it with the proper amount of research and rigor that I would for anyone else. And so I also always want to remember my positionality with this work. Yes, I am Black, but that doesn't mean that everything should be accessible to me if I don't feel that I should have access to that. So I also want to make sure that I'm not taking that from another LGBTQ researcher that is doing good work there. I may be able to uplift it and cite it and that kind of thing, but I don't want to position myself into that space when I can't do it justice and I don't share that same identity to do it well. But again, you can't ignore it. So it's just, I always find myself in this sensitive balance. But you are absolutely right. I do find it similarly hard to find those statistics. I have not been able to. Maybe someone else on the panel has, and they can talk more about that. But it is something that I'm aware of, and that I try to make sure that I get the language right, that I talk about these groups within the work, so that they're not ignored.
Okay, here we are. Great. That is a really wonderful question. I think that it's so important that we don't think singularly of African Americans as your man, your woman, right, and that you don't have all these other dimensions of personhood. So I first want to really affirm that. I would say that it's important to maybe think about building blocks in this research. And so what I do is I very much look at the ways in which the constructions of gender and families are not, the dominant constructions or ideas about the structure of families and about gender roles have been placed on top of and used to stigmatize African Americans, right? So we had different forms of family depending on where we came from before we were brought here in bondage. We had different roles for women. Women had different ideas about what womanhood was, right? So I think if we think about gender, the ways that the instances and stories of gender transgression, you know, in the sense of people presenting as male in order to seek freedom, for example, there's tons of examples of that, of not only just passing, but passing in a different gender in order to participate in not only running away, but actually in being involved in battle. So those are the stories that you may be able to go to military records and learn about, right? And there's also just more fundamentally thinking about, again, Black womanhood and the diversity of ideas and constructions of what that means that come out of oral histories, that come out of records about so-called stigmatizing. I think there's a lot of discussion this morning about Black sexuality and the assumptions that Dr. Ray talked about with Black women's sexuality. So there's criminal records. How are we criminalized, right? So there's, I think, opportunities for us to look at just the ways that the constructions of gender have stole from us the full breadth and width of our humanity.
Can I just shout out a great edited collection called Sexuality and Slavery, edited by one Dr. Berry. It is a really phenomenal collection of essays that get to so many different aspects of this history that might be interesting for your students as well, but also for all of us here.
One last point is Candace Lyons, a former student of mine who was at UT Austin and now is a professor at UC Santa Barbara. She's doing a book on this topic. And it should be out in the next probably 2 years max. And she's done the research that you just described, found people that were intersex during slavery. She found people that were not just cross-dressing, they're actually trying to get ways to change their genders in the 19th century using medical records and all kinds of things. So there is research on this. And I think just remember that name, Candace Lyons, Lyons. Thank you.
So just to dovetail off of what Dr. Roberts said earlier, prisons have been really fascinating sites, I think, that help shape our understandings of both race and sexuality, right? So in my research, looking at the Texas prison conduct ledgers from the 19th century to the present, these lists the convict's name, some demographic data, and where they are housed for their incarceration period. But it also lists the ways that they are disciplined and punished by the state, and for what infractions or transgressions. And throughout these 19th century documents, right, I kept seeing convicts being whipped for sodomy a lot. So much so that I think I presented at the Texas, we shall not be named, but I presented at a conference about this very topic because it was really fascinating to me. One, because I think, after being Dr. Berry's student and taking courses on gender and slavery, the question of, thinking about sort of the full range of possibilities within enslaved communities, and how I think most histories have been fairly heteronormative in their approach. It was illuminating to me to see, like, oh, right after slavery, folks were doing some things, right? And so what the ledgers revealed to me, I think, was a state, Texas, that was, one, obviously uneasy by this behavior because men were typically punished between 12 and 17 lashes, right? But there was also this sort of evolution in the law regarding sodomy in the state of Texas, right? And I think, if anything, one of my mottos after being at UT that I've sort of taken on, and it's really helped sort of guide some of my research, is, what starts in Texas changes the world, right? When you think about the ways that, so the LGBTQ rights, for example, a lot of those cases have come out of Texas, right? Lawrence v. Texas, right? So my point is, and I'm very convoluted right now, but my point is, prison records are replete with all kinds of interesting anecdotes and raw statistical data about, I guess you would say, queer interactions. And historian Robert Chase has written a masterful account of these phenomena in the, I guess, late 20th century, where Latino men, young Latino and white men, were basically used as sex slaves in the Texas prison system. And we have those records, and we have tons of oral histories to sort of corroborate, their stories. And we have the state's response to this particular phenomenon. So prisons, they tell us a lot. Check them out.
Can I get that name? That was a student again. You said it has Janice? Candace. Thank you. Thank you.
I think, do we have time for just one more? I will also say this. If you go through the exhibit Black Cowboys: An American Story, what you'll find with some of the women they are described very masculinely, right? You kind of have to think about how you're interpreting the sources. When I read for Black Cowboys, a lot of times when I come across women, they spend a lot of time cross-dressing, right? They spend a lot of time dressing up as men and riding, and they're described as being better than men. So, like, you really kind of have to think about how we're reading these sources, and because people don't use the same language you use today, right? And so it may mean, we don't always understand exactly what it means, but there's definitely the space there for these alternative ways of them living their lives.
Thank you guys very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Question. The question I'm posing to the whole panel is, are trillions enough? Now, the backdrop to that question is, I am and my sister are descendants of the original 300. So we came in with the entourage of Stephen F. Austin. Caleb Wallace was the last one to be seated in 1824, and we were the property of Caleb Wallace. We were gifted over as a wedding gift to William W.H. Woodard, who later became the Grand Dragon of Grimes County. So we are 6, my sister and I, out of 8 generations, from New Filipinas to the Spanish territory, and then the Mexican territory, and now Tejas, and now Texas. On that side, on the other side, and that's the Woodard Plantation, which is right about 1488 in Hempstead, off of 290. Same family out of the Mississippi, out of Yazoo County, Mississippi, the Bridgeport Plantation. We are generations 4 out of 6 because there are gaps in the progeny. So here's the question. In the 1800s, the first $1 billion in the world history was coined in Mississippi. At that time, economically speaking, the United States was #1 in the world, Great Britain was #2, and I think there was kind of a deal about whether France or Germany was #3. But Mississippi was #4 in world economies in the 1800s. As in, if the United States did not have Mississippi, it would not have made the top 20. So this is the 1800s we're talking about, the first time $1 billion, the B word, is even used. So now we're talking about trillions? Maybe not. Maybe we haven't come this time to the proper computation and calibration. Maybe it's a quadrillion.
Hi there, Elisa Cuellar here on behalf of HEB and Favor Delivery. My question is a little bit selfish, so my apologies to everyone. So I'm Liberian American. My mom's family is indigenous to the part of West Africa that was Liberia before it was Liberia, and my dad's is a descendant of the first Americo-Liberians. Over the last year, I've been trying to do research on where those descendants came from. I think they came from Cambridge, Massachusetts, but just curious for those of you that are historians who can point me in any, for any resources that might be able to help me with maybe ship manifests as I'm trying to track that part. The second half of my question is, I'm a part of a very large Liberian American community right now, and while I find myself very frustrated trying to track that history, I feel the burden of also documenting the current history, so we don't have people going through as much work to learn about the Liberian American experience, because you had Americans formerly enslaved that went to Africa and then returned to Africa because of the Civil War that happened there, which I think is a direct result of slavery in America. So just any insight would be helpful.
I might be able to answer the second question. You're in a museum, and what we do is collect stories, and we help people learn how to collect stories. And so you're in a place where this resource is available, where we can actually point you in the right direction with how to do that, how to set those kinds of things up. So there is help available, and museums that's what we are here for. There's community museums in particular, that's what they're there for, is to help people learn how to do those things. So you're in the right place.
Thank you.
So missionary records might be helpful for you in tracing genealogy, particularly in the 1800s. There were the colonization movement, and missionaries were heavily involved in that, particularly to Liberia. So I would suggest online the Presbyterian letters. I believe it's Presbyterian Historical Society missionary records. And there are records from the early 1800s into the 1900s. And it has a very robust finding aid where you will be able to find missionaries who worked with also free black people and formerly enslaved people who went to Liberia. So I would start there. Mentioning Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard also has an amazing library where they have the whole collection of the American Board of Foreign Missionary Letters. And so that's even a wider repository that you could take a look at. But to start right online, the Presbyterian Historical Society has thousands of letters from missionaries, and quite a large amount deal with Liberia.
Thank you so much.
I was just going to quickly say, my husband is writing a book about this, so.
Oh, and just in response to that, University of Virginia has a high concentration of all those records. So.
Massachusetts Historical Society has the records. There was a black physician that went to Liberia. His memoir, I can't think of his name right now, but his memoir is there. And some of the ship records of the families that left and went there, that's also there. And also University of Virginia Library has a lot of the SWAM collection.
Hello, my name is Devin Taylor. I'm a 16-year-old creative writer from Northeast School of the Arts at Lee High School. Throughout this convention, we've talked a lot about properly teaching Black history. And in 2021 alone, 44 states introduced bills that have taken steps or are taking steps to restrict the teaching of critical race theory and sexism as we know it. And as of January 2024, 18 states have bans against teaching critical race theories, while 9 states currently have bills and policies that are passing through legislation which will ban critical race theory. My question is, how do we think this is going to affect the school system in America, and what can young students like myself across America do to push the thorough teaching of our history? I mean, in Florida alone, new standards are saying that slaves benefited from slavery. I have cousins that are 3, 4 years old coming home telling me that, hey, did you know that we benefited from slavery and that I wish I was a slave? And I had to stop him and tell him, no, don't say that. So what can I as a young Black woman do to, properly teach and thoroughly teach the history of Black Americans in the United States.
Thank you for the question. Is this being recorded? So I teach in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is eerily similar to Texas in terms of its politics. What Texas does, Oklahoma tries to one-up it, and So, the laws are there, and I think for the first year or so, mostly tailored toward, or targeted rather, K-12 education, right? And I think for a lot of my colleagues, there was a sigh of relief as the bill made its way through the state legislature that, we were untouchable because it largely pertained to K-12. Not fully realizing the snowball effect, because those students have to eventually end up in front of us in the classroom, woefully underprepared and ill-informed. So it certainly has increased the heavy lifting that we already have to do in the classroom. And so earlier when someone was asking about what do we do with teaching, the dean of the medical school was asking how do we make safe spaces and whatnot. I've taught for more than 10 years at the K-12 level. And one of the few things I actually learned from teaching is it's vitally important as the teacher to, and I hate using the cliche phrase, like meet the students where they are, but you do have to do that. You also have to listen intently and assess their prior knowledge and be willing to be flexible in your curriculum planning and be open to revision. It's not enough to simply, trot out the, often used lectures or whatnot. You have to, update that stuff and basically talk to the people who are in the room. So with that being said, it's a mess right now. And unfortunately, I don't think it will get much better for the next 18 months until midterms. But here's the important part for all of us. I made a comment on social media, which I don't advise people to do, when I think stuff was happening in Florida, of all places. And I was stunned at the reaction of community members after the fact, after these laws had been passed, after folks had lost their jobs, after textbooks had been deeply censored. And I kept asking myself, where in the hell are all of the parents, the community members, where are the folks speaking, on the front end before these things go into effect? Now, that was a genuine question that I had. But I think, it's important that we all stay vigilant, stay knowledgeable, but most importantly, we have to use the resources, the tools that we have available. We have to vote. We have to figure out who are we electing to local school boards, to these textbook councils, et cetera. It's not enough to be reactionary after the fact, right? And so I think that's what's happening in a lot of places. Moms for Liberty, they're well organized, right? And they have swooped in, they got Oklahoma, right? They swooped in and they've ushered in major changes. And here we are after the fact, now nervous about what is poised to happen, no longer in K-12, but now at the university level. And at my own institution, Black history, AFAM studies, Black studies, we're potentially on the chopping block, right? And that is something, not only us, but a lot of ethnic studies programs, women and gender studies programs. And of course, the rationale is, of course, the anti-DEI stuff, but there's also, the often trotted out excuse or justification of austerity measures, right? We had to save money. So as the university becomes more corporate, you see these kinds of things happening. But it's important that we all get involved in the process before the crucial decisions are made.
And I just want to agree. Also, you said something that I really liked, that you said you had to correct your little cousin or sibling, right? I think there's some power in we have to educate ourselves, right? We have to educate our families, educate our communities ourselves if our schools won't do it, if the books won't do it. I think there's a lot of power in that. I've had not quite that experience, but I've had similar experiences where I've had to help my younger cousins with their homework when I was like, that assignment's not right. Like, okay, you do that to turn it in, but let me tell you the real, right? Like, we need to make sure that you know that you're educated, you do what you need to do for this grade, but as a person in this world, as a Black person in this world, I want to teach you, right? And so sometimes we have to do that as the older person, as the more experienced person, especially for our younger generations. It's not the solution that's going to fix everything, but for that person, it matters. And for the person that when they get to be your age and then they have little cousins or little siblings coming along and, passing it down that way.
Thank you. I think I will add one more thing, thing, and then I think we have time for one more question. You're in a room and at a conference full of educators and other students. You have community, right? This is an opportunity to network and to meet people who obviously they're thinking like you are, right? They're concerned and they want to be prepared for what's coming. They want to find ways to teach this history. And so think about who's around you too, right? And network with the people who are around you because you're not alone, right? I know sometimes when we're going through these things, it feels really isolating. But one thing that you see in this conference is that there are people who are like-minded. There are people who understand the importance of this history. There are people who understand why we need to do this kind of conference in response to all these things and to be ahead of them. So you're not by yourself. There are other people here who are thinking like you, and just take the time to get to know some people today.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. I'll be fast. Everyone here has inspired me to do my own research and continue writing papers on this and research papers and publishing them. So thank you, everyone who's here. Thank you.
I just want to jump in right quick. Also, this young person, I see lots of young people in the room. There's a whole row of young people right over here. I have teenagers, and so this is like my mom role, unless my teacher professional role. Each one teach one, be the change you want to see. Demand this information, this education, this knowledge in your classrooms, of your educators, of your parents. Even though there are attempts to silence this information in many ways, having students young, in their 20s saying, I didn't know this information, thank you, I want to know this information. So ask for it, demand it yourselves, and not always rely on us to be there to give it to you.
When you demand it, we'll be there to back you up. But if it comes from the students now, that's the only way I think we can make a big difference, if it comes from the students. And then educators like us and in the room can then back you up. I think that's going to be one way to change things.
And that happened as a support. That happened at my medical school when, after George Floyd was murdered, our students came to us and said, hey, we need more social determinants. We need more on racism and health. We need to know more on this. And then we couldn't ignore it. We had to go in and re-up what we were already doing and add more, but that came from the students. At some point, you can't ignore the students who are paying and saying, we want this information. So students have a lot of power.
Unfortunately, this is the last question. I mean, we're not going anywhere. You can still ask us.
Sorry. Okay, so I did have two questions, but for time, okay, I'll just ask one. And since we're already talking about education, it'll be about education. So the president-elect has talked about dismantling the Department of Education. And here in Texas, with our governor already pushing the voucher programs and school choice, and even here in San Antonio, how we saw all those schools closing at SAISD. I'm assuming I'm here in a room of a bunch of educators and people that value education and learning. What can parents do to prepare their kids going into public education that's potentially going to look real different than what it does today? And I mean, not parents like us that value education and have extra time to come and do these things, but the ones that have to work 2 jobs and can't get off, or don't have the time to put extra time into going and finding resources. What can the community do to prepare our kids for this potential change without panicking.
What I have to say is a bit general in terms of all of us being very intelligent and ready and wanting to be prepared. But I would offer two things. One, there's a book called On Tyranny, and not only there's a comic book version of this, On Tyranny. So that's number one. And it basically talks about, in other countries, what are the kind of top signs of dictatorship coming, and what is it you do and what you don't do. And we've seen probably little memes and examples of pieces of it, but one of the most important things articulated is not to submit in advance. Don't submit in advance. That's for children, that's for educators, that's for all of us. So I think it is keeping your children or not putting them in a posture to automatically be afraid and submit, but to think more how to prepare them to demand and how to empower them to say things like, that's not what I was told. That's not what I learned previously. Why has it changed? So I think it's just important for us not to go into that posture.
Stuff is, fixed. We can all dig in and get in the fight. But that point about not submitting in advance is crucial, because we already are seeing the capitulation at the university level by politicians, and most importantly by the media, right? So yeah, check out Tim Snyder's On Tyranny, and I think it lays out some really pragmatic and practical steps, but of course it's a historical take on what fascism and tyranny looks like and sort of how to thwart it. So yeah, just stay in the fight, and especially young people, demand more and better from the adults around you.
Right. So how do they go about doing so? So when they start taking away the free lunches or their resources are removed, what's our next move? Where should we start looking?
Can I just share this? Many of us has heard about what's been going on in South Korea. I'm just going to say, take a look at South Korea and how they reacted. I'm just offering an example. I'm not giving you any advice right now. I'm saying, take a look at the reaction in South Korea.
So I think with that said, let's give our speakers a round of applause. And we're gonna have box lunches now. So they're out in the foyer. Oh, they're in Memorial. They're in the Memorial Auditorium. So please go in there, take your time, enjoy your lunch, come back in here.